Pleasure to have everyone with us today, and especially those of you who are visiting. We do have some people that are regular visitors, and we're grateful that you're with us. Please let us know if we can be of any help to you. And there are new visitors, and we're glad that you're with us. And it's good to see Parker Hens with us today, and welcome him home for a little bit. I remember, like probably you, being a child when the ominous words from your mom and dad said, "That's the third time I told you." Imagine how that felt with the Apostle Paul when he said the same thing to them, and now the third time I'm going to come to you, you need to get this thing all figured out. We've been talking through 2 Corinthians in our lessons on Sunday morning, and that's what he says in verse 1 of chapter 13. This is the third time I am coming to you. And he says in verse 2, I've previously said when present the second time, and though now absent, I say in advance to those who've sinned in the past and all the rest as well, that if I come, I will not spare anyone. Since you are seeking for proof of the Christ who speaks in me and who is not weak towards you, but mighty in you. When Paul is finishing up the letter, there are many things that he says that don't immediately make sense to us or resonate with us, simply because we don't hear the inflection of the writing that the apostle is making. I'm sure you've been the kind of person that you've said something to someone and the inflection came out wrong. It always happens with your spouse, and the inflection comes out wrong in a way that you didn't intend it to come out. So, with charitableness, we need to read Paul's words to the Corinthians as he finishes the letter. And I'd encourage you to read all of it on your own. But I want you to note that what Paul is saying, as noted, as we just read, that you just seem to not believe that Christ has put his authority in me. And there is perhaps a tinge of what we might call sarcasm. There might be a tongue-in-cheek response on his part. But the Corinthians had demanded proof of Paul's apostleship. They had brought into their attitudes this worldliness that Saul, who became the Apostle Paul, doesn't really deserve to be heard. He doesn't look like an apostle. He's not impressive like an apostle. And we don't really like the lofty way that he speaks. He's not one of us. But Paul makes the point to them, as he says in chapter 11 and verse 30, if I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. He says, you've picked out all of the things that you can criticize. As you've touted these great false apostles, as he calls them in the latter part of the chapters. But he says, we all have weaknesses. But at least my weaknesses are used to glorify Christ. So Paul boasts in the struggles of life that he shows to them, acknowledging that I'm not afraid to speak to you. I'm not afraid to tell you the way things need to be. I want you to understand that I am not in the least inferior to these most eminent people. But he'll go on to say in chapter 12 that the reason that he is this way is that a vision that he received from the Lord were words that made him changed his life. For if I do wish to boast, I shall not be foolish, for I shall be speaking the truth, but I refrain from this so that no one may credit me with more than he sees in me or hears from me. And because of the surpassing greatness of these revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, to keep me from exalting myself. And he said, I am asked the Lord to take away this thorn in the flesh. No, I'm not going to tell you what it is. But Paul will say, when I am weak, for Christ's sake, then I am strong. And he'll go on to say the reason that is the case is Jesus will say to him, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is perfected in weakness. But with that as the backdrop, as he finishes in chapter 13, the note that we said, third time I'm coming, and if y'all don't get things in order when I come, I'm going to use some severity. In fact, he'll tell them in verse 5, test yourselves to see if you're in the faith. Examine yourselves. They had spent several months, maybe even over a year, criticizing the Apostle Paul, putting him to the test of the mechanism of testing that only Paul was being challenged to live. They had made a really good skill of putting other people to the test, and now Paul says, well, if you're so good at putting me to the test, now put yourself to the test. We might say you've got one finger pointing at me, you got 3 fingers pointing at yourself, and a thumb. Or we would say something like, you need to go look in the mirror. And Paul says, y'all have really chiseled up this skill of testing. Why don't you go test yourself? So though he boasts in the struggles of life to show that Christ is powerfully working in him, and though he exhorts them to recognize that, don't you realize that Jesus Christ is in you? Unless, of course, you fail the test too. But he says, but I trust, verse 6, that you'll realize that not only do you not fail the test, neither will I. So he says in verse 10, for this reason I'm writing these things while absent, in order that when present I may not use severity, in accordance with the authority which the Lord gave me for building up and not for tearing down. Notice Paul uses strong language to correct mistakes or failures that he sees in the brothers that he loves so deeply. But still his point is that when we are together and when I come together with you, I don't want to harass you and severely punish you for doing wrong. Instead, I want to bask in the joy of our fellowship that we have together in Jesus Christ. And then, like a very good preacher, he tells everyone he's about to finish. And he says, finally. And our lesson is about his finally. He spent 3 chapters defending himself. He spent 3 chapters telling them that I know that these are my weaknesses. And he acknowledges them, and maybe even a sarcastic tinge by making the point that you may say that they are greater, but I am far better. But he says, in all of these weaknesses, I let Christ be glorified. And so he says, finally, brothers and sisters, verse 11, rejoice. Finally, brothers and sisters, be made complete. Finally, brothers and sisters, be comforted. Finally, brothers and sisters, be like-minded. Finally, brothers and sisters, live in peace. And finally, brothers and sisters, greet one another with a holy kiss. A letter that reeks of the challenge and the despair that occurs when relationship has been jarred and separated because of distrust or because of saying wrongful things about another. Paul finishes this most very open-hearted letter with kiss each other with a holy kiss. when you greet. So what do these final words to Paul really mean? We're coming to the end of 2020. Finally, right? And looking forward to 2021 with the hope that there will be something better by God's good grace. And for you and I, the exhortations to live finally, as Paul says, are exhortations that belong to us all year round. Not because of special music, not because of the the exchange of gifts, not really even because of the gathering of family, but because of what Paul knew Jesus Christ was in them. So the first thing he tells them, finally, brothers, to do is rejoice. Joy in the Lord is your responsibility because you're a follower of Jesus, not because it is a feeling that you have nurtured. Not because it is a response to the events that are unfolding in your life, but because it is the fact that you are indeed a Christian. Notice when Paul says in Philippians chapter 4, he says in verse 8, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good report, if there is anything excellent, and if anything worthy of praise, let your mind dwell on these things. That finally that he reached with them in verse 8 was the answer to explain what he would mean in verse 4. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Even in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 17, we are called to rejoice in the Lord always again. Which means that joy is always available to you if you will choose it. But the flip side of that, it does not mean that we are never sad. The flip side of this reality is not that we are never down or depressed. In fact, the Bible says in two very succinct words why you and I must know that that is the truth. Jesus wept. That's not a verse to tell you that men must use Kleenexes too. It's not a verse to sabotage manliness in our modern world, although there's probably some things to sabotage. But it means that the God of the universe, in the human predicament that he was, felt. And even when the joy that was set before him, in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2, he still wept. I love what C.S. Lewis says. I now know, Lord, why you utter no answer, because you yourself are the answer. The reason I can rejoice and follow finally, brothers and sisters, with the same exhortation in my life as I exhort you to do the same thing as we come to this year and we begin the new, the reason there is to rejoice is because there is the Lord. And that's a reason to rejoice at all times, if he is truly your Lord. But then the second thing in the New American Standard, verse 11, says, be made complete. One translation, the New Revised Standard, says, listen to my appeal. The English Standard Version says, aim for restoration. But the idea behind the structure of the word is simply to recognize that what we're supposed to be doing is applying the things that Paul says and find ourselves right with God. I think it is the translation, the original New American Standard says, mend your ways. Because that is in fact what we're supposed to be doing. To be complete, as Young Literal's translation gives these words their meaning. Put things in order. You come to the end of the year and things probably have felt all crazy all year round, and as you turn into January, then all of the cleaning sales will all be going on. My wife will go crazy. All the appliances will go on sale. We'll probably need to buy a new vacuum. No, I'm kidding. But isn't that what happens in January? We put everything in order. We clean up everything, the mess that we've made all the last month. And we get back to, I hate to say this. You know what I'm going to say, right? Get back to normal. Well, Paul says that after I've recognized that the reason for my joy is the Lord Himself, then I need to put things back in order. The Apostle John will say in 2 John verse 8, watch yourselves so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win the full reward. And the application he'll make is right in the next verse by saying, don't go beyond the teaching of Christ or you will lose Him. So when we are putting things in order or we're aiming for the restoration, maybe Paul had in mind is be restored to this brother that I told you to be restored to that you withdrew from. Maybe he's saying, be restored to me, put things in order with me, so that when I come, there doesn't need to be this big kerfuffle about all of the things that you've done wrong. But knowing the sentiment of how Paul has always made his ministry apply, he's saying, get yourself restored to God. Mend your ways with Him. Because you may want to mend your ways with your brother. You may want to mend your ways with the Apostle Paul. And all of those things may need to be done. But in the final analysis, you need to restore yourself to God. That's why Peter would say in Acts 2 verse 40, save yourselves from this wicked and untoward generation. But notice the third thing he says. In the New American Standard, it says, be comforted. Other translations will turn the direction of the comfort to not to be comforted in yourself, but comfort other people. Which is, in fact, the reality of what the whole letter began with, if you remember. He said, the reason that we are comforting other people is because God has comforted us. That we finally begin to put together the whole story that God loves us so much that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes Him is so that the rest of your life can be miserable. No, that's all right. Will there be times that you'll weep like Jesus? Absolutely. Does that mean you're not a good Christian? Absolutely not. But what it means is that you recognize that the experiences that you have in your life are for the purpose of making you helpers to other people. Be comforted in what other people do, or find yourself comforting other people in what they do. But more than anything else, it's the language that Paul says to the church at Philippi in chapter 2. Make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, let each of you regard one another as more important than himself, not merely looking out for your own personal interest, but for the interest of others, and have this attitude in yourselves which was in Christ Jesus. True comfort will only come when we start acting like the true comforter. Rejoice. Aim for the restoration of yourself with God. and comfort one another. But then notice what else he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11. The New American Standard says, be like-minded. Be like-minded. It's an interesting point because really in the final analysis, if I'm recognizing that the Lord is my cause for joy, if I'm living my life to be right with Him and aim for that restoration, and I'm living my life by the comfort that that gives me so that I can comfort others, why would it be hard to agree with you? Or even more so, why would it be hard for you to agree with me? Anyone ever walked up to you one time and said, why did you choose that shirt? I remember one person, dearly and beloved, told me I needed to stop wearing white shirts because it made me look fatter than I really was. And I'm very confident that they had love in their heart when they said it. Because the fact is, we're human beings who falter and fail. And when Paul says, as he writes to the church at Corinth, if you think about how rattled they would have been through the experiences that the letters tell us they've gone through with super apostles, performing themselves around as if they're some greater person than the Apostle Paul. As if somehow they have some special knowledge that the rest of the apostles don't know. A church that's begun in chapter 1 with the description that why are you all so divided? Saying you're after Paul, after Cephas, after Apollos. Why has Christ been divided? And rhetorically, the point is absolutely not. Christ will not be divided. His people will be united in one with Him. But the only way we will keep that unity is if we'll choose to be like-minded. Even to the church at Rome, Paul said, Romans 12, verse 18, as long as it is possible, as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. That's not a verse for you to go around and say, well, they don't want to live peaceably with me, so I'm going to take it out on them. That's not what Paul's saying. That what causes you to choose your action is you. Live peaceably with one another. And then as he finishes, he says, live in peace in the New American Standard. And then he says, greet one another with a holy kiss. As a young preacher, this is one of the verses that I love to preach about. I'm not really quite sure why. I think it's because in Bible class we talk about it an awful lot. We have a lot of fun with it, maybe because I'm sure there's some men in this room that would be very affronted if I walked up and kissed them. Especially without a mask, right? But we all understand that culturally, in different parts of the world, even today, people, when they greet one another, they kiss. So the issue is not kissing. I don't know that I'll run from you, Norman Davis, if you come up and kiss me. But he says, greet one another with a holy kiss. He's not asking them to start doing something they weren't doing. They were already greeting one another by kissing. That's the way they did it. He wasn't putting into motion an apostolic example that was to be binding in all churches, in all cultures, by telling them when you see each other, you better kiss. What he is saying is when you greet one another, it better be holy. There is a welcome between brothers that we probably feel more than ever before in 2020 that aches the arms when it's not fulfilled. the presence of being with one another. Talking to senior citizens who are in assisted livings and unable to get out without the threat of quarantine, who since the month of March have not been able to be with you to worship, except through live stream. How it aches their arms to not be able to hug you, to not be able to greet you and tell you how important you are to them. So what Paul is saying in these final exhortations, finally, is that after y'all have been through all of the fighting and the bickering that you've gone through that's caused that division that's described in chapter 1, and all of the fighting and the bickering that's resulted because you followed yourself around some super apostle, which is not really an apostle at all, and you've challenged the authority of Christ in me as your apostle. Greet one another with holiness. Bury the hatchets. Stop being like the world and start being like Jesus. Because finally, that's what God is looking for in all of us. To rejoice, to be restored to Him, to comfort one another, to agree with one another, and to, with holiness, greet each other at all times. We must be the one who does this. We must not be the one who waits for the other to do it. God calls us to rejoice, whether or not you rejoice. God calls us or me to be the one who's trying in my life to be restored to God, whether or not any of you ever decide to be. It is up to me to comfort others and be comforted and agree with one another, even with you not choosing to be agreeable or comforting to me, because that's what my Jesus has called me to be. Finally, a manifestation of His true holiness. And even the way that I welcome you, open my arms, my home, and my heart to help each of you make it to heaven. Because finally, that is what our every year, every month, every week, and every day is about. Go to heaven with me as we choose to be His children.
I will praise you with all